lovely Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm thrilled to be here. I will just give you a couple of caveats. The first is I haven't done this before, and as I was saying to Zoe and Gavin earlier, I normally move around a lot when I talk, so I'm hoping my energy will be quite okay as I've sat down the whole time. And the other is that I have 2 dogs in the other room. I have a partner who is doing his level best to keep them quiet, but we may be intruded upon at any point with some booming barks. So that's just the background. Before I start, I just wanted to thank the conveners for the invitation to speak. So Rochelle, Sarah, Gavin, Zoe and Corey, who've put this amazing conference together over 3 time zones, no less, which is no mean feat. Thanks very much for the invitation to the keynote. And also a thank you and a shout out to Zoe and Corey for pushing this International Association of Vegan Sociologists. In some ways, I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few weeks as I've been writing the keynote. And in some ways, I'm amazed that we didn't have this before, but in other ways, I absolutely understand why we've never had this. And I'm an academic sociologist who has been working in the area of human animal studies and critical animal studies now for about 20 years. And throughout that time, I've been involved with various organizations such as Society and Animals, the Animals and Society Institute, ICAS, and also journals in the area. So I've kind of been really well placed to both see and be a part of some of the changes as our field has grown. And one of the changes that I think is perhaps one of the most important is this growth of a critical approach towards animal studies. And I think it's that critical approach that has prevented associations like this starting in sociology. As I'm about to talk about, as much as I am a sociologist and an academic sociologist who loves her discipline, I'm also very let down by mainstream sociology, its refusal to deal with animal issues and animal questions, and its seeming fear of being radical, which I think is becoming exacerbated in the neoliberal academy. So there's quite a lot there. They're the kind of things I'm going to be talking about today. I think it's really important that we have this space as vegan sociologists, because as Zoe said, very often when we go to sociology conferences, there's no animal papers. And when we go to animal studies papers, there's very little sociological papers, but we know that we're out there, we know that we've got the tools, and we know that we're doing this work. So I think it's really important that we have these spaces that let us do this work, that let us find each other, because that sense of having an ally can be incredibly important. But also, I think it's really, really important that we're able to have conversations where we start from where we're at. So by that, I mean, and I'm sure you'll have all been in this position where you give a paper at a conference or you write a paper for a mainstream journal or whatever, and you spend most of your time justifying your position, why you might want to study animals as a sociologist in the first place. And while that's important, and it's really important to engage with other disciplines and also with the general public, I think it's equally as important to have a space where we can start where that's a given and we can push and stretch our thinking with each other. So that's a very long-winded way of saying thanks for the invite to talk. Just to give you an idea of what I'm dealing with when I use these terms, I think as sociologists in this field of animal studies, we're negotiating quite a complex terrain. So I think that there are some umbrella terms that we work within. So it may be human animal studies, anthrozoology, critical animal studies. My view is that these are very different, that really anthrozoology and critical animal studies sit at opposite ends of a pole. So anthrozoology, I think, is largely anthropocentric. It's largely positivist. And it tends to be apolitical or claim to be apolitical or depoliticized. Of course, even claiming neutrality is a political stance, but that's an argument for later. And then critical animal studies eschews all of this and sits at the other end and asks that we as scholars become engaged in attempts to make animal lives better politically, however we may define that. And I think human animal studies sits somewhere in the middle. So I think there are human animal studies scholars who fall to both camps, and it may be, like I've done work across all three of these at any given time, so it can depend on studies and things like funding bodies and so on. So I think that's kind of the umbrella that we're sitting under. But within that, as sociologists specifically, we're starting to see the rise of some newer terms where we're trying to carve out a distinctly sociological space within these umbrella terms. And some of the terms that I've been reading lately are, Zoei and I came up with the idea of emancipatory animal sociology in one of our papers. I don't know if I'm making false claims to that, whether somebody else came up with it before us. I often also talk about a politicized animal sociology, and lots of people have talked about the difference with a sociology for other animals rather than a sociology of other animals. And you can see in this quote here, which I can't quite read to you because all your faces are over my screen, that there's a difference between acknowledging the importance of animals and challenging their oppression. And I think where we're moving, certainly with the vegan sociology, is towards these radical, critical, liberatory terms. So we're trying to work within fields where we're aiming to emancipate animals, we're aiming to identify their oppression, we're aiming to use the sociological tools that we've got to do that, and we're aiming to do it in order to challenge them. This isn't just an intellectual exercise. I remember first reading Steve Best's work in the mid-2000s when he started ICAS. And he's written several pieces that are really quite critical about the idea of theory for theory's sake. And he was also very critical of career academics. And I was quite a young academic at the time, and I wasn't fully indoctrinated into the system of academia, and I didn't necessarily understand what he was talking about. I fully understand it now, and I am more and more inclined to agree with him that, you know, we do need theory. We absolutely need theory. I don't think you'll find a sociologist alive who will tell you that we don't need theory, but it's about what do we do with that theory. I was talking to my first year students the other day about this, and I was explaining to them that I'd done some research with women and their animals who were leaving domestic violence. And we did long interviews. So I did this work with Heather Fraser from QUT in Australia, and we would drive out to meet these women and to meet their animals, and they would invite us into their homes, and we would often talk to them for 2 or 3 hours. And during that long period of time, there would be the whole gamut of emotions from the women and from their animals as well, actually. You know, so there'd be laughter and there'd be tears as they laid their lives and they laid their experiences and their animals' experiences of domestic violence bare. And as I was listening to them, I was thinking, do you know, there's something morally corrupt here if we're only asking them to do this in order to scratch our intellectual itch. That somehow, if we're asking this of people, we're asking them to share these explanations or these experiences of their lives with us, then we must do something with that information that goes beyond a mere intellectual exercise. And as I'm about to explain as I move on, for me, this ties in with a feminist animal studies or a feminist vegan studies, because I think that that's a very feminist position to have around research. But to come back to the point, so I think what we're talking about here with vegan sociology is this need to have, whether we want to call it emancipatory animal sociology, vegan sociology, politicized animal sociology, it's a need to go out into the world to understand the structures of oppression that keep animals under the yoke of human conduct, and then to try and do something with that knowledge, whatever that may be within your abilities. I always go back to Becker. I had a supervisor who loved Howard Becker, and I was forced to read all of his work as both an undergraduate and a postgraduate. And to this day, I'm very glad that I did. This is one of my favorite pieces of writing. And I don't often recommend mainstream white male sociologist people, so this is high praise indeed. I give this to all of my students, and while I think that his ideas now are not so radical, they were very radical at the time that they were written. This was the height of positivism. We were, you know, it was the beginnings of symbolic interactionism. We didn't really, in sociology, we didn't really accept the idea of values, of a critique of value neutrality. But Becker wrote this piece back then that I think is still incredibly relevant now. And I think as academic sociologists, as vegan sociologists, we need to start thinking about, well, why are we doing what are we doing? You know, what's the aim here? Is this for my career? Is it so that I can get a tenured position? I can get to full professor quickly? Or is it something larger than me? And as you can see from Becker's point, his argument here was that we always come at our work with our values. We're always positioned. And that no matter how many people, or say within anthrozoology, may argue to us that they take a neutral stance, there's no such thing as neutrality when it comes to the performance of knowledge, when it comes to the gathering of knowledge, and when it comes to the dissemination of knowledge. And while this might seem niche, it might seem like I'm talking here about methods and why, you know, and how we do the work that we do. Methods are how we know the world. The information that we find through being sociologists in the world and collecting data and disseminating it, we create the world. We don't just do research on it. We are part of it. We're part of creating it. So I think we've got to ask ourselves some pretty big questions about, well, why do we do the research that we do? And for me, it's a naive attempt to make the world better. And I say that with a smile because I know that that's terribly naive. But I think when we're thinking about this, we need these kind of loose terms. You know, if my aim is to make animal lives better, and in any given context, that the meaning of that will shift, and I think that's absolutely fine. But that's what orients me towards the research, and it's what drives me to do the research. Because I can tell you now, working in academia is not what drives me. I'll come to that later. So, you know, once we've sat down and interrogated, well, okay, why are we doing this? Why would we want to study animals? And if we come to the decision that we want to study animals to make their lives better, we want to take a political or an emancipatory or a vegan feminist approach towards animal studies, then we start to think, well, okay, how are we going to do that? And of course, I'm biased. I've been a sociologist, I think, since I was born. I was just given the language of it as a teenager when I came to study it. But I've been a sociologist, an academic sociologist, for a long time. And I think sociology is the perfect discipline to do this with. But, you know, sociology it's a broad discipline. And within it, we have positivists. We have feminists, we have post-colonialists, you know, we have some really good critical thinkers, but they tend to be on the edges. And I think that we are doubly, if not triply, marginalised as vegan sociologists. I was listening to Corey the other day on a podcast saying that she told her head of school that she was setting up this vegan sociology association, and her head of school said to her that she would be hated because everybody hates sociologists and everybody hates vegans. So, you know, I think what we've got here is we've got this kind of marginalization where we're sitting at the critical edges of sociology, and we're doing that, asking even the critical sociologists to look at their species privilege and make them very uncomfortable. So we're not going, I don't think that there's going to be too many places that are going to welcome us with open arms. But at the same time, this is where I feel very let down by sociology. I can't abide the idea that, to me, a system of knowledge or a discipline or a field that aims to radically deconstruct the world and remake it in a democratic vision, however you may define that, I can't abide the idea that that discipline will close down certain avenues of thought. And I think that's what we do. I think that happens in sociology. And I think it depends on a lot of things. So with animal studies, I think it depends on where you are in the world. So for example, I would say that there's a lot of mainstream animal studies coming out of America based on symbolic interactionist work. And of course, not everybody's doing that. We have critical thinkers in America too, of course. But the main body of work that's coming from there, I think, is largely apolitical and anthropocentric. It's based on companion animals and it's based on symbolic interactionism. So I think it depends on where you are in the world. I think it depends on your orientation as well and your theoretical toolkit, if you like. So I came to animal studies through a background in both feminism and Marxism. So with those as my kind of pedigree, if I can use that term, I was never going to be a non-critical animal studies person. I was always going to look at systemic oppressions. But I think that's where we sing. I think that's where sociologists are really good. You know, when it comes down to power and it comes down to systems of oppression, the way that power manifests institutionally and the way that it has ramifications at a micro level, I think that's what we do. I think that's what every sociologist does, irrespective of the area that they are studying. So I do think that we're in a great position to do some critical work, but I also think that there is a largely mainstream sociological fear of really radical work. And I think that a politicized animal sociology is about as radical as it can get for mainstream sociologists. I mean, you'll all presumably be fairly familiar with the various arguments that have been put forward by sociologists as to why sociology is largely ignored, both the animal question but also animal oppression. And these are just some of them here. So, you know, I'm so tired of these arguments. Sociology, we study the social side of life and animals are a part of nature. Like, well, yes, okay, but if you go and read your Latour or you go and read your Haraway about hybrids, then you start to see that we can deconstruct that. Mead has done, I think Mead has probably done as much damage to our sociological study of animals as Descartes did to animals and philosophy. So Mead and his idea that social interaction turns on language, and then the Goffman idea that it turns on co-presence and understanding the position of the other, with both of them largely arguing that animals could be excluded from this. We've started to see scholars pick more nuance here, and there've been a few papers that have come out recently where we've started to see scholars say, well, it wasn't actually that straightforward, it's just been reinterpreted that way. We've also got this horrible Enlightenment intellectual heritage that we're all grappling with, where the ideas of binary differences are held up as normal, hegemonic, you know, these notions of objectivity and neutrality in research, all of which serve to underpin the idea of human supremacy, which I'm sure you'll have seen these kind of arguments. There's not enough resources to tackle human issues, so why should we give resources over to tackle animal issues? Those kind of arguments. And the reason I've kind of given a very quick and dirty overview of these is that I think these all come from a fear of a politicized animal sociology. I think that in exactly the same way that hatred is directed in mainstream society at vegans, I think that these arguments come from sociologists because they don't really want a politicized animal sociology. And the reason that I don't think mainstream sociologists would want something so politicized is that it turns everything upside down. And I mean absolutely everything. And not just beyond the kind of milk that are in tea rooms in academic institutions or the kind of food that we eat at conferences, but it forces us to go back through the history of our epistemology and to actually overturn it from the very beginning. And that is huge. So it's no wonder that people don't like us, I think, is where I'm going with this. But I also think that because it is so huge, and because it's got so much radical potential, and not just radical potential for other animals, right? Doing this helps humans, if we want an anthropocentric argument for it. I think that that's where the challenge is. That's where the excitement is. That's why we're seeing so many people flock to this idea of an animal sociology, of a politicized animal sociology. Sorry, wrong way. So what do we have to offer? If I've convinced you now that we need one, what does this politicized or vegan or animal emancipatory sociology have to offer? Well, I'll be quite quick here because I've kind of covered a lot of this, but we've got these structural analyses and nuanced considerations of power. We've got some great theoretical tools, and these are just some that I prefer to work with, but there are lots as well. And methodologically, I think we've got the ability to look at both the micro and the macro. And increasingly, as much as I hate the neoliberal use of the word innovative, we're seeing some innovative research methods. And I think they open the door for us to include animals in our research, which I think is needed. You know, we've got some fantastic papers around how mainstream sociology and social sciences more broadly that has sought to address things like class discrimination or racial discrimination or sex discrimination, has done so without including the bodies of people that it's aiming to help. Well, we're doing the same thing in animal studies more often than not. So we need to get over that. We need to find some of these innovative methods to include animals. And I think as sociologists who largely are obsessed with methods, we're in a good position to do that. I also think that perhaps the strength that this kind of a sociological approach has is that it lets us take sides. You know, we can look at Becker, we can look at Goldner, we can look at feminist research, and we can use them to legitimate our own politicized stance in terms of the research and the teaching that we do. And I think if you combine that with research, with powerful research that aims to include animals, it can make a difference. And one example I'd like to pull out of research that I think can make a real difference is Catherine Gillespie's work. So if you don't know her work, she's written several papers, but also this book, The Cow with Ear Tag 1389. And in this book, she starts with the opening chapter is an introduction to her fieldwork where she meets Sadie. And Sadie is a cow. And Sadie gets about 3 paragraphs in the opening chapter where her life is described to us. And here is just one of them. And in the matter-of-fact way that it's written, but then the way that Gillespie takes this and embeds it in a critical and structural critique of animal oppression is so incredibly powerful. So Sadie was born and raised on a fairly large dairy farm. At the farm, her tail had been docked and her ears were tagged for identification. She was impregnated via artificial insemination at 18 months old, and then once every year after that. Her calves were taken away from her hours after birth, and she was milked every day until her productivity and reproductive capacity waned. At age of 5, she developed a bad case of mastitis, and she was sent to auction for slaughter with many other cows that had been used for dairy production. She was bought at auction by a university veterinary teaching hospital and used as a teaching tool. She spent approximately 20 weeks there, where students used her to practice venipuncture and rectal exams. And then there's another 2 paragraphs after this that tell us how Sadie was misused, and then how she ultimately has a good ending, how she ultimately ended up at this sanctuary where she doesn't really want to know people, surprise, surprise. And how Gillespie got to meet her. And I think that this kind of ethnographic work that looks at the micro details of individual animals' lives and tells their stories, I think when you add that to a macro analysis of the structures of oppression, it couldn't be more powerful in terms of reaching diverse audiences. And I do see that today we've actually got several papers that seem to be moving towards this. So I noticed one where Catherine is looking at centering the horse in her research, and then in the European sessions, Brett and Claire are talking about multi-species storytelling. You know, and I think these are exactly what I'm talking about in terms of innovative methods that seek to bring animals in. Now, for me, this is all part of a vegan feminist research, which I call vegan feminist resistance research, just because we needed a mouthful. And this is based in part on Brown and Strager's work around researchers' resistance, which they did as feminist research with Indigenous people in Canada. And it sets up the whole research process as being a politicized one, and as being one where the whole point of the research is to resist, is to challenge and change oppressions. So it's a research process that explicitly and implicitly challenges relations of domination and subordination. And the trick for us is working out, how do we do that with animals? Because with people, one of the better ways to do this is to sit down with them and do research from the ground up. So get a group of people together, ask them what's important in their lives, and do research from the ground up using their interests. How we do that with animals is difficult, extremely difficult. And I think it probably leads us towards interdisciplinary research, which means working with ethologists and biologists, which means working with different paradigms, and then it gets really tricky. I'm just going to skip on. I don't want to be too much longer. So this resistance research that I prefer to do, well, for me it's feminist, because it acknowledges a fundamental link between listening to what people have to say about their lives and exposing the operations of power and oppression and how that works on their lives. And I do think that to a greater or lesser degree, we can start to do this with animals. Key to this is the inclusion of voices that are often silenced by their marginalised positions. And I do think, certainly in the animal rights movement, we talk a lot about animals being voiceless, and I don't think they are. I think they've been deliberately silenced, and I think we don't listen to them. And I think that we can. And I don't think that they can speak to us using our language, but they can speak to us in other ways. And so there's a need for us to push from these kind of feminist resistance principles to include animals in our research. And I think Zoe's going to talk about this in her research with companion animals later, but I think we can do it with all kinds of animals. I don't think it just has to be companion animals. So it's framed as resistance because it's about resisting hegemonic narratives of around human-animal binaries and around silencing, around resisting the silencing of animal lives and including them. So to me, this is linked to the neoliberal takeover of the academy. I think we're resisting neoliberal imperatives to ignore, silence and marginalise those who are uncomfortable for neoliberalism rhetoric. At the same time, there's a need to highlight that this, we're dealing with so-called wicked problems here. It's incredibly complex. There's no easy answer. We're dealing with, we need to deal with this in an intersectional framework, but we need to be careful about our use of the term intersectionality. Same as I think that what we're talking about here is decolonising knowledge, but we also need to be careful around the use of that term so that we don't appropriate it from its original meaning. Same with intersectionality. But at the same time, these ideas allow us to realise that often the victim blaming that occurs within neoliberalism is part of the process, and that we need to highlight that and resist that. If you're an academic, and I don't know if everybody here is, you may well not be, and you're probably a lot happier for it. But if you are an academic, then I think resisting university mandates towards conservative research is really important. So universities at the moment, especially in Australia, particularly in Britain, and to a lesser degree elsewhere, universities, I think, are not so subtly pushing us to do conservative research. And by that I mean they're only supporting research that brings in big money. The kind of research that brings in big money is not the kind of research that we're talking about here with animal liberation and animal emancipation. And as a vegan sociologist, as a feminist resistance researcher who's working in vegan sociology, there's a need to resist those mandates. And that's hard. My last institution went down this road. I'm just being mindful that I'm being recorded. And I found it exhausting to have to be constantly vigilant to make sure that I wasn't falling into what it was that they wanted when what they wanted was not what I wanted to do, nor what I thought was valuable. And I think as well, this, you know, this resistance research I'm talking about is it's about resistance because the focus is on the structural manifestations of power versus individual blame, which is the neoliberal mandate. But at the same time, if you are an academic sociologist, you know, you might be nodding along thinking, yeah, this is great, but we do face some very real pressures if we want to keep our jobs. So, you know, funding, commercial viability, the need to publish in tier 1 journals, A-star journals, Q1 journals, whatever it is that your country calls them, that kind of stuff. We're also working within the politics of knowledge production, which determine what kinds of research are done, with and for whom and on which topics, and which are taken seriously, and largely high theory that's incredibly critical of the status quo, that's based on qualitative research, is going to be down at the bottom of the pile for all of those. So we're fighting that too. And some of the questions that I think we need to ask within all of this is that how are we as academics able to negotiate these tensions? And this is a whole other presentation, but I will say that, you know, some of the tensions are complicity versus resistance. You can't resist all the time. But when you do resist, well, I've adopted resistance research that's let me do passion projects, that's kept my passion alive for staying in an academy that doesn't necessarily see the world the way I do. And I think once we do that, it leads us in unexpected directions and with unexpected findings. And so here's an example. The domestic violence research I talked about earlier, we set out to do this to look at the importance of keeping, it was women that we talked to, women victims of domestic violence, of keeping women and their animals together post-domestic violence recovery. And we deliberately set up the interviews so that we got to meet the animals, partly because we wanted to, but also partly because we wanted to include them visually in our research and take photos of them. And in so doing, we actually found our animal-centered research led us to findings that we'd never considered before. So we knew that animals were affected by domestic violence, obviously, but we didn't know the true extent. And I don't know that we'd have ever got to that if we hadn't have actually tried to include them, to meet them, to see their behaviour, to have them in the room when their humans were talking about them. Led us to now actually become advocates for not necessarily keeping all humans and all animals together post-domestic violence. You know, we went in there thinking that we were advocates for the women as well as the animals, and that we would be advocating to keep them together. And we came away thinking, actually, no, it's far more complex than that. There are some situations where they shouldn't be together for the good of the animal. And I don't think we'd have got to that finding had we not developed kind of animal-centered research. And here's another dog who absolutely should have stayed with her humans and luckily did, but she went through some terrible health complications as a result of her abuse. And I think when we do our animal-centered work and we try to include them, because animals are actually beautiful and usually far more photogenic than humans, I think we can come up with some very impactful research through developing animal-centered research. I mean, I think these two pictures from studies that I've done around visual methods and animals, I think they speak volumes. The one on the right is a little terrier who was affected by domestic violence, and the one on the left is a dog whose human loved her. This was after 3 days apart. This woman reminds me of me. So she'd been apart from this dog for 3 days, and this was their reunion. And I think it just speaks volumes about human-animal bonds. Anyway, so I think we can devise some very impactful research. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this kind of positive-looking research as well. You know, visual methods can also ask us to think more critically about some of the issues involved, even just in keeping companion animals, you know, whether it's just or not, as well as the oppression of other animals. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment in terms of my studies. And I think, you know, I've been thinking about, well, where do we go next as vegan sociologists, as animal sociologists? I think what we need to do is reflect on our own positions within the neoliberal academy, if that's where we're based. and commit to social justice-based research, which sounds really straightforward, but if you do work in the neoliberal academy, you'll know that that's actually fairly difficult. I think we need to challenge oppression in our theories and our methods and our intellectual legacies. I think we need to do it across the board. And I think we need to be quite open as well about our own position here. You know, we change as we grow and we do research. I think we can model dissent. I love the idea of modelling dissent. I think we can do it as critical educators in the classroom. And I think we can do it as feminist anti-speciesist researchers in the academy. And it takes all forms, you know, it can just be from advocating to have soy milk in your meetings through to much bigger ways of modelling that kind of dissent. We can consider alternatives. I think one of the things that sociology is really very good at is being critical. But what we're not so good at is looking beyond the critique at, well, okay, if what we have isn't working, then what might? So I think we need to get some imagination going, we need to get some alternatives, and we need to look at the way people already are resisting speciesism and recognise it and get it out there. I think through part of that would be looking at models of respectful, reciprocal human-animal relationships and characterising them as dissent. I mean, I think a lot of the work that women do, I'm talking women particularly do, on the front lines of animal rights movements, you know, looking after farmed animals in sanctuaries. I mean, I think that's dissent. I think that is a massive critique of human-animal relationships, and yet it doesn't ever get talked about as such, or rarely gets talked about as such, and I think it needs to. And finally, I think we don't, you know, let's not be scared to admit our limitations. If we're talking about innovative methods that include animals, let's talk about what it can't do as much as we can talk about what it can do. And I think from that, we'll become better scholars who can hopefully, you know, make some kind of small difference for these billions of animals who are oppressed every year by our practices. That's me. I'm finished.
Thank you for that. That was really good. I think there's like silent applause. We just can't hear anyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, they look like they're applauding. Do you mind if I turn off your screen for the questions so we can see people?
No, go for it.
Excellent.
I'm just going to mute me while I have a big drink.
All right, so we've got one question. Are you ready for questions? Okay, so we've got one from Nick Pendergrast, who asked if you're aware of any anthropological work that's already extending ethnographic work to looking at the lives of animals.
Yes, absolutely. I came at this as a sociologist because that was, you know, it's the Association of Vegan Sociologists. I didn't mean to be exclusionary. I think there's an argument to be made, Nick, actually, that anthropologists got on board with the animal stuff way before sociologists did. And I do think there is some good critical anthropological work being done. I also think there's some there's a bit of disciplinary, it's permeable, the barriers are permeable. So we've got some people who are sociologists that are doing anthropological work, and we've got some anthropologists who are doing more sociological work. So I absolutely think that there's a lot out there, and I didn't mean to exclude it. I can't give you any names off the top of my head though, if that's what you're asking for. I'm sure you know them anyway.
Excellent. Just making sure I'm not missing anyone before I jump in with my own questions. I have a theory question, and I'm loath to raise a theory question because I always think sometimes that's a way of distancing ourselves from dealing with real material aspects of animals' lives. But I keep getting this question about looking at macro and micro relationships, and particularly when you were talking about ethnography, and you know, ethnography is really powerful for visibilizing animals' lives. How do we theoretically connect that with kind of broader power structures and the ways that we talk about kind of systems of domination and things? Does that fit? I know we talk a lot about messy methods and messy theory. What do we do with that?
I think it can fit. I think I'm about to commit sociological heresy here, but you know, I think originally when ethnography and the kind of symbolic interactionist stuff and the ethnographic movement first kind of came about late 1960s in sociology, I think it was arguing against positivism as much as it was arguing for its own attention to micro life. And as such, I think largely because as sociologists, we want to have our binary separations and our pure distinctions. You know, it became either or. So there was this sense of you can't do ethnography and be political because you're only attending to micro aspects of life. And I don't think that we would hold, I don't think that we should hold to that kind of clear-cut distinction anymore. I think that you absolutely can go out and do some ethnographic work around the way women in shelters are looking after cows, like Sadie, or you know the way that people, I'm just thinking of work that I've done, the way that people frame dogs in shelters as people. I think you can do that and then link it to the broader theoretical discussions of oppression. Because the only reason that Sadie is in that sanctuary is because of all of the abuse that she suffered originally, which we can document and link to kind of capitalism or wherever we want to take that. Same as the dogs in the shelters. The only reason that the shelter workers are giving them personhood is to elevate their status in a world that sees them as disposable. So I absolutely think we can marry the two together. It just might not go down so well in certain areas, but aren't we at the stage of kind of like, well, it doesn't go down well anyway, so just do it.
Pretty much. Do you get that comment a lot? I get that comment a lot that gets thrown back in my face that it's theoretically impure.
Yeah, all the time. And I think, so what? You know, I've been working in feminist research for all of my career, and if there's, you know, there couldn't be more of an impure field as feminism. It draws from wherever is useful, and I think that's absolutely what we should do. If our aim here is to emancipate other animals, use whatever tools are out there, and that is sociological heresy, I'm telling you.
Excellent. I feel like you're leading us down a good path. Gavin, do you have any questions before I just dominate this Q&A with myself?
Nick, that was a fantastic talk, brilliant keynote, like so many great issues. I think it's scaffolded for the rest of today as it moves across continents. I guess, yeah, just one question I had was your sort of relationship with ecologists, for example, and whether you see them, because you made some really nice points about these kinds of, you know, disciplinary paradigms clashing, colliding, but potentially also unfolding with each other, and seeing some of the complementarity between what some ecologists are doing and what some sociologists want to do. So I was just wondering whether you see, you know, that kind of relationship as being one, you know, which carefully managed could become quite useful for two things. One, kind of putting the sociological perspective into, you know, into the field of wildlife management, conservation practice, but also, I guess, yeah, just making, potentially making our lives in neoliberal academies, which are all about interdisciplinary connections, a bit more easy in terms of how we navigate some of those mandates that I completely agree with, that we're always kind of having to rub up against in terms of our research being directed. So yeah, just wondered what you thought about that focus on ecology as being a potentially interesting space of a partnership.
Yeah, look, I think it would be great, but I think it's really hard. I'll start with the positive. So I think as the, you know, as the birth of this association has shown, so these emancipatory vegan people, we hide everywhere. You know, we're often forced to hide and we're often forced into the margins. So I think if you were to start, I'm thinking about Adam Cardellini and, you know, the kind of work that he's trying to get going around vegan scientists. So I think if you were to start these kind of organizations in other disciplines, you would find more people would come out of the woodwork if they had a home. But it's difficult when they feel that their livelihoods and perhaps their job security is threatened. You know, that makes it really difficult. And that's why this is all wrapped up in challenging the neoliberal academy. It isn't just about doing our own research. You know, it's a massive snarl of horrible things. But I do think that it's there. When it comes to conservation, that's even harder again. I mean, I've lived in Australia, so I know the Australian politics around conservation, and the Aotearoa in New Zealand politics are just as awful. it makes it very difficult because you're dealing with people whose allegiance to a particular paradigm that is a very dominance-based paradigm that gives them the right to technologically maim, kill, and otherwise harm animals is seen as a given. So I think in conservation, it goes beyond the difficulties that you'd have with non-conservation biologists. But I think it's needed, and I think there might be some changes on the horizon. You know, I don't mean to make light of everything that's happening in the world at the minute, but I do think that the pandemic is opening up doors for us to have these kind of conversations, because obviously it's linked to how we view and treat other animals. But I mean, if you're a sociologist who wants to be an emancipatory animal sociologist working in conservation, I think your life's going to be pretty hard. Is that you? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I think it is. I think it's interesting because I feel that, and again, this is all down to the individual in many ways and their worldview, but I sense there's certainly ecologists out there who are desperately looking for a broadening of their horizons of what the social means and is and does. And so we're actually, you know, actively seeking out sociologists to, you know, collaborate with them in thinking about, you know, ecological futures which have that kind of socio-ecological dimension to it. And you know, and I'm just thinking here in the context of like the bushfires, for example, of 2019 and 2020 in Australia, and as we all probably are very aware, the massive figure of 3 billion potentially animals killed or displaced. And you know, of course, we can question the techniques, the science of how that number has appeared, but nonetheless, massive devastation. And I just get the feeling that this is, yes, in that context of, you know, shock and horror, there might be an opportunity for us to talk more about these things in more holistic and complex ways, where sociologists are, you know, at the table in some of these kinds of wildlife conservation moments and events and practices. And I certainly feel that from my perspective, yeah, it's better to be at the table sometimes than it's not to be on the margins all the time. And so I'm kind of trying to, you know, leverage those kinds of relationships. And I know it's going to be difficult because there's a lot of transversality happening here and different languages and knowledges and epistemologies being used. But I think still there's room for us to do some really nice sharp work which informs how these folks are operating. And I do agree with you. You know, the conservationists, yeah, have this sort of privilege of, you know, managing, controlling nature out there. But at the same time, some of them really care about what they're doing and are really reflexive about what they're doing and want thriving, flourishing ecosystem. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting, wild space to be in because there's so many interesting kind of tensions and opportunities, I think, for sociology to do some work there.
Yeah, I think climate change is a way in as well in those conversations. You know, if you can get across to them that the way we treat animals is inextricably linked to climate change, which is inextricably linked to the bushfires, then, you know, it's about working out those commonalities. And I've also found on a very practical level that a lot of the work I've been able to do has been just down to finding that one person in the organisation who is on board for whatever reason. You know, so some of the stuff I've done with the domestic violence victims, you know, this is a field where more often than not, people are going to say to you, why would you spend money doing this research? We don't have enough money for the human victims, so why would we care about the animals? And all it's taken is one key person in an organisation who maybe loves her dog, or, you know, she's crazy about her cat, or whatever it is. And then they're suddenly on board and that's an opening, and you're in. So it's also about kind of being strategic. And the one thing I struggle with is sometimes it's about shutting your mouth too. You know, if you're around that table and you're going to alienate everybody with saying something, work on the relationships first and do the alienation second.
I just want to jump in with one more question from the chat. We have from Amit. She wants to know if there's any specific focal geography for vegan sociology theories at this stage, and what your thoughts are on the implications of these theories and practices in the context of the global south. Lost my words now.
Give me the first bit, sorry, with the geographies?
Do we know if there's any specific focal geography for vegan sociology theories at this stage?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that, but I do think that implications in terms of the global south. I mean, I made a nod to the idea that this is linked up with the idea of decolonizing methods, which I take from Linda Tuiwai-Smith's work, where she was working with Maori in New Zealand. And I think what we're talking about here, when we start talking about politics of knowledge, that we can't ignore the North versus South gap, whether it comes from where we publish in journals through to the kind of theories that we use, which tend to be Eurocentric. And if we're going to resist one thing, then I would say let's resist all things. And so I think the implications for the global south at a theoretical level are that we're starting to see critical scholars more open to ideas that are coming out of the global south, and not just the global south, but also indigenous ideas around the world that really, it's a different paradigm. I'm starting to do some work here with a Maori scholar. We're trying to get funding to look at how a kind of Te Ao Maori conceptions of human-animal violence. And it's such a different worldview, and there are so many strengths to it that I think we could borrow from, as long as it's okay for us to borrow them. And so, all of this to me is about the politicized production of knowledge, and that comes down to the global northern dominance and enlightenment intellectual heritage that I think we need to fight against and be willing to look at and engage with other ideas. And following people like AFCO, I think this needs to be more than kind of a cosmetic diversity. So, we're not just dealing with inviting, in this instance, I'll use my example, it's not just about inviting Tangata Whenua or Maori to come and give us their perspective as research participants. It's about including them in the research and doing research from a Tangata Whenua perspective, from a Maori point of view. Now, I can't do that as a white fellow, obviously, but, I can work with people who are able to conceive of it that way. So, I think this is all politicized stuff, and I think we need to be open to those ideas.